911 Baker, you need police, fire, or medic?
Police, I'm just shot.
How'd this happen?
I was following my baby daddy, Rae Carruth, my boyfriend.
Where's he at?
was in the car in front of me, and he slowed down, and somebody pulled up beside me and did this.
And then where'd he go?
He just left. I think he did it. I don't know what to think of.
Cherica Adams called 911 after she was shot 4 times. Of the 13-minute 911 call, nearly all of it was spent trying to get Cherica's locations so that the medics could treat her. This being 1999, there was no way for somebody to get their exact location at the touch of a button. Thus, the 2 operators and Cherica had a long conversation trying to triangulate her position based on the roads she went down and landmarks that she passed. Eventually, they managed to find her after Cherica smartly drove into someone's front garden and honked her horn. The homeowner then called the police and provided the exact address. That didn't stop the first responding officer from initially driving past her, but they were quickly able to find her after that. Also on that 911 call, Cherica managed to solve her own murder. She laid out that she was following the Carolina Panthers wide receiver Rae Carruth's Ford Expedition. Rae slowed down and a car pulled up next to hers and shot. Rae then fled the scene. The police instantly put out an all-points bulletin for Rae, and he was found just a few hours later at the hospital where Cherica was being treated. A pretty open and shut case, except this case went to trial, and Rae Carruth had the resources to hire David Rudolph, an excellent defense lawyer, and clearly David Rudolph had his work cut out for him. Now, by no means was Cherica's 911 call the totality of the evidence against Rae, but realistically, even if Rudolph undermined everything else, Rae would probably still be found guilty and get the death penalty if the jury believed what they heard on the tape. So, let's see if David Rudolph can once again get his wealthy client off the hook, or maybe even if Rae is innocent after all. But before we get to the defense, we need to go through the rest of Cherica's post-shooting statements. The police and medics found Cherica in her car in the driveway of Farrell Blaylock's home. There, police officer Grant and EMT Michaels treated her. Blaylock also came out of his house to see what was going on. Cherica was prepared for emergency transport to the hospital, but Officer Grant had enough time to ask her who shot her. She replied that it was Rae Carruth. Everybody at the scene heard that and testified to it. Cherica was rushed to the emergency room, and it was quickly determined that she needed immediate surgery. While waiting for the elevator to be brought up to the surgery floor, Grant asked Cherica if her boyfriend did this to her. She said yes, and after Grant requested that she elaborate, she told him that she had gone to the movies with Rae that night. Afterwards, they went back to Rae's house to get her car, and they traveled in convoy to her apartment together. Along Rae Road, Rae came to a stop and a car pulled up next to her and started shooting. Shortly thereafter, she called 911. She underwent emergency surgery and had to have a breathing tube put in. While recovering at the hospital, Cherica was alert when Nurse Tracy Willard came to check on her. Cherica was not able to talk, so Willard held up a clipboard for her to write on. Cherica wrote that Rae stopped his car in front of her in the middle of the road and another car pulled up beside her and shot her. Rae then drove off and never came back. That lines up with the 911 call and Cherica's statements at the scene and at the elevator. She wrote that Rae insisted that they go to her apartment after they returned to his house from the cinema. Rae called someone who he claimed to be his teammate Hannibal Navies shortly before they left and told them that he and Cherica were leaving now. The prosecution, looking at the phone records, now think that Rae actually called Michael Kennedy, who was the driver of the car that would a few minutes later pull up next to Cherica and shoot her. Rae did later call Hannibal Navies though. He was driving in front of Cherica, and while she was on the phone with her cousin to tell him to clean up the apartment because Rae was coming over, Rae was on the phone with Hannibal to say that he was coming over to his house. That is something that Rae did actually do after he fled the scene of Cherica's murder. After these notes were completed, the doctor decided that Cherica needed to rest to heal, so they increased her morphine dose and put her to sleep. Cherica never woke up and died weeks later. That is some pretty damning evidence, but David Rudolph needs to make some argument against it, and there is only one possible defense in this situation. Cherica clearly isn't lying, so she must be suffering from a faulty memory. Rudolph brought in 2 expert witnesses who did a great job to substantiate this theory. Dr. Lee Pelham is an anesthesiologist who testified about the effect different medications and blood loss have on the body. During her surgery, Cherica was given multiple drugs. Dr. Pelham said that these would have a negative effect on her cognitive functioning. He testified that in North Carolina, a patient cannot give informed medical consent until 3 hours after the final issuance of any of these kind of narcotics. But Cherica was not only given these drugs during the surgery. Due to being intubated, she was continually given drugs to keep her comfortable. So, in her state, Cherica would not have been allowed to testify, but her written statements from that time are being used in court. That needs to be considered by the jury. Cherica was also particularly susceptible to certain compound effects of the drugs. She was shot in the liver, so she would have a slower rate of metabolism for the medication. Thus, the effects would have lasted longer. She also lost a lot of blood, which was replaced by a salt solution. This meant that there would be a lack of proteins in her bloodstream, which would result in more drugs being delivered to the brain as opposed to being spread out around her organs. The drugs Cherica was given also had a synergistic effect, meaning that they would have a larger total effect than one would expect from simply adding the dosages together. 2 of the main medications Cherica was on were Versed and morphine. These were metabolized by the same enzyme, meaning that if the liver were damaged, as it was in this case, less of that enzyme would be produced and the 2 drugs would have an even longer lasting effect. Dr. Pelham didn't speculate how big the effect of all that would have been on Cherica's cognitive functioning, other than saying that he would expect it to have a negative effect. But he did state that the Versed dose alone, without taking into account any of the other circumstances, would have an equivalent effect of a blood alcohol concentration of 0.11, meaning that she wouldn't be allowed to drive. The cumulative effect would have been much, much more. For what it's worth, the drugs affect different people in different ways, and everybody that was present while Cherica was awake and writing the notes said that she was alert and didn't appear to have any cognitive deficits. It also helps that the statements she wrote on the paper match her accounts from the 911 call and from the scene at Farrow Blaylock's house. Dr. Pelham did describe the effects blood loss and trauma can have on the brain to possibly give an explanation of how Cherica could also be wrong on the 911 tape and at the scene. But blood loss does not have even close to the same level of effects as the drugs would have had. For the pre-surgery statements by Cherica, the defense would need Dr. Elizabeth Loftus. She is a memory expert. But before we get to her, I just want to quickly say that this is the final part in a 4-part series. A huge amount of work has gone into creating this detailed account of the trial. So if you are enjoying this video and think other people should see it too, please like, subscribe and comment to help out in the algorithm. Thank you, and back to the video. There are a couple of factors that Dr. Loftus noticed while analysing the 911 tape, which makes Cherica particularly susceptible to false memories. First, Cherica was under a lot of stress. She had just been shot 4 times. That can affect the accuracy of memories. Second, she was not completely focused on answering the questions about who did this to her. Cherica was understandably preoccupied in getting help for her and her baby. When the 911 operator asked her who shot her, Cherica said that she was 8 months pregnant. If one is focused on something else and one's memory is weak because of stress or blood loss, that could lead to incorrect answers. Elizabeth Loftus also cited some of her own studies that would be relevant for Cherica's situation.
One of the things that I was looking at in a study that I published with a co-author, Terry Burns, is where we tried to look at not what the effect of a physical brain injury is, but what is the effect of looking at something that is just absolutely mentally shocking, and to what extent would that create retrograde amnesic effects. And just briefly, what happened in this particular study is we showed our subjects, and these are adults, healthy adults, a 2-minute and 15-second film. The first 2 minutes depict a bank robbery unfolding. The last 15 seconds are a very, very violent ending. 2 bank employees are chasing the robber out into the parking lot. He turns to shoot. He hits a little boy in the face. The boy holds his face. He's screaming. It's a very upsetting, violent ending. And what we did is to splice off the violent ending. So we kept the same 2 minutes, spliced off the violent ending, and replaced it with a non-violent ending. They're back in the bank. The bank manager is telling people to calm down. It's 15 seconds, exactly the same length. And then what we did out here is to test people. We asked them, both groups, the group that saw the violent ending, the group that saw the non-violent ending, we asked them about the common portion of the film. It was identical. It was identical. And yet, the people who saw this violent ending were less able to answer questions about the first 2 minutes of the film. In other words, the eruption of the violence, this mentally shocking ending, had a retrograde amnesic effect. And it especially impaired the memory for a detail that occurred right here, about 2 to 4 seconds before the eruption of the violence in the case with the violent ending. So what seems to be going on here is that when we do experience something that is mentally shocking, it can disrupt some of the processes by which we consolidate information into our long-term memory and have it be available to us later on. And when you are exposed to post-event information that is misleading in some way, exaggerated in some way, wrong in some way, people will often pick up that post-event information and adopt it as their own recollection. And it can lead to an exaggeration, a distortion, a contamination, a transformation in a prior recollection. And so just to give you, a couple, I think I can use this page, a couple of examples from my own experiments that I think illustrate the effects of post-event information. One of the easiest ones to talk about, and one that's in many of the psychology textbooks now for students, is a series of studies that I and my collaborators did in which we showed people an accident. And in this accident, a car, for example, goes through a stop sign. That's what actually happened at the event. But afterwards, we asked people some leading questions. Some of our witnesses are asked leading questions during this retention interval that suggest to them that what they saw was a yield sign. How do you do that? You ask a question like, did another car pass the red Datsun while it was at the intersection with the yield sign? You're the witness. You think that's a question about whether another car passed or not, but it slips in the information. It was a yield sign. Later on, we can come back to these witnesses and we can say, what kind of traffic sign did you see at the corner? And under certain conditions, as many as 80% of our witnesses will say they saw a yield sign. They have succumbed to the suggestion in the post-event information, and they've adopted it as their own recollection. So this is an example just of a piece of experimental work designed to study the process of how people pick up post-event information and adopt it as their own recollection.
Were there any leading questions in the 911 call? Dr. Loftus thinks so.
How about in the retrieval or recall phase? Are there factors that can affect the accuracy with which information that has been acquired, assuming it was acquired accurately, and retained, assuming it was retained accurately and there's no post-event information contaminated? Are there still factors that can adversely affect a person's ability to accurately retrieve or recall the information?
Yes, there are now a new set of factors that come into play here when you're asking people to recall, remember, retrieve. And so one of the important factors there is how are the questions asked? If you ask a witness leading questions, you're going to get a distorted answer. We asked witnesses who had seen an accident, for example, how fast were the cars going when they smashed into each other? And those witnesses will give a higher estimate of speed than if you ask the question, how fast were the cars going when they hit each other? If you ask a leading question like, he was a heavyset fellow, wasn't he? You're more likely to get an answer that conforms to the suggestion than if you ask a more neutral question. So the lesson there is that the nature of the question and the way a person is tested on their memory affects the information you get.
What about the factor of a person's concentration on what they're being asked, or their preoccupation with some other topic at the time they're being asked something? Can that have an adverse effect on retrieval?
Well, certainly if somebody is preoccupied and thinking about something else and not thinking about comprehending your question and responding accurately to it, you can get erroneous answers. And especially if somebody is in a highly aroused, highly stressed state. So that when you're extremely upset and extremely aroused, you can even answer questions incorrectly that you would have clearly answered correctly in a normal or neutral or unstressed state.
Violent trauma can also influence the timing in someone's memory.
Can memories of events, the timing of memory of events, be compressed by certain factors?
Yes.
Could you describe how that may occur to the members of the jury?
Well, for example, one way that it might occur is because of retrograde amnesia. So if something very shocking, a trauma happens, and a person has some retrograde amnesia, a reduced ability or even an inability to remember a period of time prior to the trauma, then you may find a situation where the person is saying, the last thing I remember is this event, but it might be something in the relatively distant past rather than the immediate past. That would be one situation where you might get this sort of compression of events.
If you were trying to evaluate whether or not retrograde amnesia had adversely affected a person's memory by compressing time, would you want to know whether an event that was similar to what they were describing, had occurred a short time previously in order to evaluate whether or not there had been a retrograde amnesia that in essence compressed time in that situation?
The objection's overruled.
Yes, you would.
Could you explain why?
I think if I could explain by reference to an example in the literature of a woman who was... Oh, thank you, Your Honor. Who was injured, and she said, the last thing I remember is saying to my son, Donald, don't bother me, and then she was shot. It turns out that a pathologist analyzed the situation and found out that a long time earlier, Donald was bothering her, and she said, Donald, don't bother me. But that was not what occurred just prior to the injury. She had a retrograde amnesia that extended over this extensive period of time. So it was the last thing she remembered, but it was in the distant past. So that's the kind of point I've been trying to make about why I would answer your question, yes, that a similar event in the distant past could become compressed in time, mentally compressed.
What about an event in the more recent past? Can that also become compressed in time?
Well, that too, yes.
Is there any reason why it would be any less likely for an event in the more recent past to become compressed, or more likely for...
I think it would probably be more likely, where she says... At the very bottom, I was following my baby's daddy, Rae Carruth, the football player, and it was the medic or the 911 operator who says, so you think he did it? And her response was, he slowed down and a car pulled up beside me. So it was the operator who raised this question first with her about whether she thought Rae did it.
And could you just talk a little bit about how that sort of thing can end up having an effect on what a person ultimately says or recalls or expresses?
In general, as I testified to yesterday, when people are asked, just in general, when people are asked leading questions, sometimes they will conform their answer to the question. So sometimes when you ask a leading question, people will figure out what the expectation is in the question and respond on the basis of it. In this case, it's a question that has a bit of suggestion in it, and it may have planted a seed in her mind.
There were also significant changes in Cherica's account between the multiple times she gave it. On the 911 call, Rae slowed down and another car pulled up next to her and shot her. After the medics found her at Blaylock's home, she said that Rae shot her. This is clearly incorrect based on all the other evidence in the case. So that would be an indication of some memory impairment. At the trial, Officer Grant claimed that at the hospital, just before her surgery, Cherica said that Rae not only slowed down, but came to a full stop, and then she was shot. Grant's incident report only mentions Rae slowing down. So let's just assume that his memory from when he wrote the report was fresher and more accurate. By this theory then, Cherica only mentioned that she was stopped and blocked by Rae after the surgery when she was plied full of drugs. Dr. Loftus also has a potential theory as to how her story evolved after the surgery. Officer Grant was at the hospital while Cherica was being worked on by the doctors, and Cherica's parents and family arrived. They were desperate for answers on what happened to Cherica, and Officer Grant spoke to them. At the trial, he claimed that he didn't disclose anything related to the shooting to the family. But after their chat with Officer Grant, family members made phone calls that had information that only the police would have known at that time. After being released from surgery, Cherica was awake and communicating with family members by her bedside for a considerable amount of time before Nurse Willard arrived and had her write the notes.
Is there a concept in your field called source monitoring?
Yes.
Can you briefly describe what that is and how that might relate to this issue?
Source monitoring refers to the fact that you sometimes have a piece of information, and now you're trying to figure out the source of that information. Is it from your own personal experience? Is it from something somebody told you? And a source monitoring error is an error of deciding where you got that piece of information. This is something that's been meticulously studied by a psychologist named Marcia Johnson. And so when people remember a piece of information and think it came from their own perception rather than from another source, they are committing a source monitoring error.
And would someone whose cognitive functioning is impaired by drugs be any more likely to commit source monitoring errors than someone who is not on such a regimen of drugs?
Well, in my opinion, yes. I mean, in fact, there is even evidence that people do sometimes make more errors in recalling things that were not spoken or present under the influence of the sedatives alone.
What do you recall learning?
To the extent you could learn anything about the types of questions that were being asked of Cherica in the room and that sort of thing.
Well, first of all, lots of questions were asked. You have evidence of that coming from different family members in their interviews. The questions, there's no recording of exactly what happened except for the recollections and the scribbling. But by necessity, these questions pretty much had to be leading questions because Cherica was not speaking her answers, being intubated, and she was, basically having to answer yes or no, essentially. So by necessity, it was not possible to ask her open-ended questions the way you might want to ask in an ideal sort of interview. And is there anything more specific than?
Is there anything about the nature of the people who are asking leading questions that has any relevance to your analysis?
I can say, and I don't remember if I testified about this yesterday, that the one thing we do know, just speaking generally, that the status or the source of the suggestions is an important factor, that suggestions that come from either a high status source or someone who seems to know, or somebody who seems not to have a particular bias, can be more influential in terms of contaminating the recollection of someone. So when you have a nurse and law enforcement and family members in there, you have at least important sources, one would think, in the mind of somebody who is hearing any suggestions, assuming those suggestions are uttered.
How about the length of time that the questioning went on? I think, according to Nurse Willard, it started somewhere around 7:40, and I think, according to the police officers, they came in about 8:30.
It means there's a fair amount of opportunity for some suggestive information to be supplied, but just the mere length doesn't really mean anything more than that.
And would her cognitive functioning also be relevant to the extent it was adversely affected during that particular time frame?
It could be, if given what we know about the effects of the drugs and her very poor condition.
Ms. Loftus, taking into account all of the events that we've talked about so far, including the drugs that have been administered to Miss Adams over the course of that evening, and what Officer Grant had said to the family, what the family members had discussed among themselves, what they may have said to Mr. Carruth, conversations they may have had with Cherica Adams.
Overall.
Were you able to form an opinion with regard to how her report of what had occurred out at Rae Road had changed from slowed down to stopped and blocked over that 7 or 8 hour period?
Objections, and that was a change. Well, the objection's overruled.
You may answer.
In my opinion, that is a change. And in between the changes is a fair amount of suggestion. People with knowledge, people with suspicions, people with knowledge and suspicions interacting with Cherica, and it could be responsible. I cannot say it was, but it certainly could be responsible for a shift in her report in the direction of more culpability or involvement of Rae Carruth.
Putting everything together, what is the prosecution's theory of what happened to Cherica that night? Cherica drives behind Rae's white Ford Expedition along Rae Road. She calls her cousin to tell him that Rae is coming over to her apartment and to clean the place up. Ending that call, she sees that she is on the phone and correctly assumes that he is talking to other women. Cherica is now no longer in the mood to have Rae come over to her apartment, so she starts to pull up beside him. Rae slows down and they have a quick conversation about Rae no longer being welcome. Rae turns around and drives home, while Cherica keeps driving to her apartment. A few minutes later, another car pulls up beside her and she slows down. Van Brett Watkins signals for her to roll her window down. Cherica doesn't want to talk to him, so she flips him off. Watkins, in a rage, then shoots her 3 times as she leans to her side to try to avoid the shots. Her foot comes off the brake, so her car stops decelerating and lurches forward a bit relative to the shooting car. Van Brett Watkins then fires 2 more shots and speeds off. Cherica has been hit 4 times, so she drives away off Rae Road and calls 911. She is in a state of shock, due to the extreme unexpectedness of the violence of the situation, but she is mostly focused on her baby. During the 911 call, the medic asked her how the shooting happened. Suffering from temporary retrograde amnesia because of the extreme violence of being shot, she says the last thing that she properly remembers. She was following her baby daddy Rae Carruth, the football player. The operator then asked the leading question if she thinks if Rae did it. This influences her vulnerable memory, and actually, she does remember Rae slowing down, and also, a car pulled up beside her and shot her. Cherica has been influenced by a leading question to misremember the timing of two events, to incorrectly connect them in her brain. After 10 more agonizing minutes, police and medics find her, and Officer Grant asks her who shot her. Cherica relays a false memory that it was Rae who shot her. She is rushed to the hospital, and while waiting for the elevator, she once again mentions to Officer Grant that Rae slowed down. This slowing down has now been definitively connected to the shooting in her brain. Cherica awakes from her surgery and is significantly impaired due to the physical trauma and also the drugs used to keep her comfortable. Her family is by her bedside and have concluded that Rae is guilty due to the fact that, according to Cherica's prior call to her cousin, she was with Rae shortly before the shooting, and also Officer Grant had told them that Cherica had said that Rae was involved. Her family can only ask her leading yes or no questions due to her being on a breathing tube, and they unintentionally influence Cherica's memory to change her recollection to Rae stopping and blocking her car. Cherica then writes this on paper when Nurse Willard arrives. The prosecution obviously says that this theory is ridiculous. Cherica wasn't that impaired after her surgery and seemed alert. There were also many examples of other leading questions she was asked which didn't change her story. They also pointed to Cherica being mentally alert on the 911 call and providing accurate information about where she was, with correct spelling of street names, and she also correctly identified the location of her injuries. They also noted that Dr. Loftus was not a member of the American Psychological Association, which is the largest organization of its kind. For what it's worth, Dr. Loftus said that she left the group after it was spending too much time on the work of the suppressed memory ladies. But literally ignoring that and taking Elizabeth Loftus's claims to be true, is the defense's theory reasonable? It is possible, but compare this convoluted tale to the theory of the prosecution. Cherica is driving behind Rae's white Ford Expedition. Rae slams on the brakes, and in turn so does Cherica. Watkins's car then pulls up next to hers and shoots 5 shots, hitting her 4 times. After Rae and Watkins flee the scene, Cherica drives off of Rae Road and calls 911. She tells the 911 dispatcher what happened. When medics arrive, she tells them that Rae is responsible. At the hospital, she once again tells her story to Officer Grant, and after her surgery, she writes down her account of what happened. When it's put like that, it all looks pretty simple. Also, the crux of the defense's case is the difference between slowed down and stopped. Before the surgery, Cherica said Rae slowed his car down, and after the surgery, she said he stopped. When Cherica said Rae slowed down, the defense is theorizing that she is remembering a previous event minutes prior where Rae slowed so she could tell him he wasn't welcome at her apartment that night. If Cherica had said on the 911 call that Rae stopped, this theory would be disproven? Well, these two terms, slowed down and stopped, can often be used interchangeably. The entire defense case rests on a very distinct difference in verbiage. But that aside, there is one more piece of evidence from Dr. Loftus's testimony that I think could also explain this discrepancy.
We asked them about the common portion of the film. It was identical. It was identical. And yet, the people who saw this violent ending were less able to answer questions about the first 2 minutes of the film. In other words, the eruption of the violence, this mentally shocking ending, had a retrograde amnesic effect. And it especially impaired the memory for a detail that occurred right here, about 2 to 4 seconds before the eruption of the violence in the case with the violent ending.
If we use this example, with the violent event being Watkins's car pulling up to Cherica's window and shooting her, and we exclude the last few seconds before that happened due to retrograde amnesia, what would we have? Cherica would remember Rae slowing down, but not coming to a complete stop, losing a couple of seconds and then the violent event. Now, I don't know if memory works this way. This video is about the trial of Rae Carruth, so going to newer sources to litigate if expert witnesses were correct or incorrect misses the point completely. At the end of the day, this is the evidence that the jury saw, and having seen all of the evidence, how did the jury rule?
We, the jury, returned the unanimous verdict as follows: that the defendant, Rae Carruth, is guilty of discharging a firearm into occupied property, guilty of using an instrument with intent to destroy an unborn child, guilty of conspiracy to commit murder of Cherica Adams, but not guilty of the first-degree murder of Cherica Adams. Is that your verdicts, so say each of you?
Yes.
Not guilty of first-degree murder, the charge carrying the death penalty. Legal experts suspected that it was a compromised jury verdict. The jury deliberated for 4 days and contacted the judge about not being able to reach unanimity. The elements needed to find Rae guilty of the first 3 charges are the same as those to find him guilty of first-degree murder, so the verdict is not logically consistent. Thus, it was suspected that those on the jury that thought Rae was guilty traded finding him innocent of first-degree murder in exchange for those thinking he was innocent, finding him guilty on the lesser 3 charges. One of the jurors disputed this claim. She said, "None of us felt that Carruth was innocent of any of this, but because there were so many unanswered questions, we couldn't convict him of first-degree murder." A lot of credit needs to be given to the defense for this. They were meticulous and genuinely had a response to everything the prosecution put forward. They were not always the most convincing responses, but they did a really good job based on what they had to work with. Because Rae is either guilty or genuinely one of the most unlucky people ever. What do you think? We've seen the key witnesses now. Maybe you've even gone to the Court TV website to see the full testimony. Leave your verdict down in the comments. Well, the last thing to do is to catch up on the defendant's sentences. The gunman, Van Brett Watkins, pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and was sentenced to 50 years in prison. He was serving his sentence when he passed away in 2019. The driver, Michael Kennedy's gamble to testify without any kind of plea agreement paid off, as he later pled to lesser charges and was sentenced to just 11 years in prison. He was released in 2011. Stanley Abraham, also benefited from Kennedy's testimony and was sentenced to just 90 days. Rae and Cherica's son, Chancellor, survived the ordeal and was raised by Cherica's mother, Sandra Adams. That leaves us with just Rae Carruth. He was sentenced to 19 years in jail for the guilty verdicts and was released in 2018. If you think that Rae is innocent, then hopefully him avoiding a life in prison is comforting to you. And if you think he is guilty, well, let's just hope he was successfully rehabilitated.